Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last of our TechSoup talks. I'm Marnie Webb with TechSoup, and I'm going to be your presenter and host for this one. We have been doing sessions over the last 5 days on 5 different topics. We did digital security, we did data governance, misinformation, counter narratives, and today we've been focused on collaboration. Earlier today, my colleague Melvin Chabole, who's the managing director of TechSoup Africa, talked about collaboration. And that is what I'm going to focus on in this talk. We've been focusing on these issues because at TechSoup, we believe this is the things that organizations have to pay attention to in an ongoing way so that they can be secure, confident, and resilient. And that's our goal, right? Is supporting civil society and being able to serve its communities. And we wanted to hear the voices of a wide array of experts in the field around this. And we had 2 TechSoup presenters for the very end of the session. As I said, my colleague Melvin earlier today, and now it's my turn. I introduced myself briefly. I'm Marnie Webb, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at TechSoup. I'm also the CEO of our product development division at Caravan Studios. And in this role, I have the pleasure of working with all of these wonderful human beings, some of whom work for TechSoup, many of whom work for other organizations, as we deliver on our mission, which is to build a dynamic bridge that leverages technology so that there can be more connections and we can see more innovative solutions that bring us a more equitable planet that's able to offer opportunities to thrive to everyone that wants it. And that central tenet, that idea of bridge building for us has been about engaging with connections with other organizations, other geographies, other roles, and holding open the space for those connections, not just to happen in the form of conversations as we've been doing this week, but also to be able to have those conversations turn into projects and tools that help us better achieve our mission. And as I go into this talk today, I have an agenda, and I want to make sure that my agenda is clear. I believe that it is civil society's responsibility. It's the responsibility of those of us working in this field to collaborate so that our communities can stay strong, resilient, and confident, so that they can act with agency, so they can bring resources to the people that need it, so they can provide multiple on-ramps to services and support and solutions of all kinds, right? Whether it's bringing food to people that are hungry or whether it's maintaining a small historical museum in a rural community. We want to make sure that that community has the access to their resources so that they can make the choices about what's important to them. Before I dive in to this topic, I want to start with a little bit of background. I've been saying in the introduction to all of these sessions that we know that civil society is under pressure. And I want to take just a minute and describe what I'm thinking of whenever I talk about civil society being under pressure. I'm talking about changed funding priorities. We've seen that as the US government has changed funding priorities. The EU has shifted their funding priorities. Foundations are responding in some cases and shifting their priorities. All of this, we know this is happening, and those changed funding priorities can mean less funding for many organizations. And that reduced funding compresses our ability to deliver services. We know that there is an increase in digital threats depending on what day it is and who you're talking to. Civil society is either the second or the fourth most attacked sector in the world. We can often think of ourselves as not having the resources to be worth attacking, but in fact, the resources that we have may be access to others like our funders or bank accounts, for cyber criminals that wish to get financial gain. It can also be access to the people that we're serving, to our donors, to our board members. And in much of the world and in many places, those digital threats are a precursor to real physical threats. We know that we have unequal access to infrastructure. We have that in the United States. We have it around the world. We saw it, in fact, in these sessions when our speaker from Cameroon was interrupted because they were having electrical grid and transformer problems. We've had various levels of internet instability as we've been doing this, and it just demonstrates that getting out of our silos can be so difficult sometimes. The climate instability is, of course, provoking a wide variety of problems. I was at an event in Oakland yesterday, and Oakland, California, and one of the organizations that was there is particularly focused on students that are impacted by climate disasters and events, whether they're floods or whether they're fires. But those things that are displacing students, destroying schools, and disrupting communities, and how are they providing support to young people to continue going through the education system when we have this kind of climate instability? So and it's happening all over, right? And we see organizations starting to respond to this. And then we also know that while all of these threats and pressures are going on, many of which, as I said, compress our ability to provide services, there is an increased need for those services. There are more people in our communities that are hungry. The pullout of some funding instruments from continents has meant significant gaps in medical services for a wide variety of individuals in those communities. But civil society is still finding new ways to work. We aren't just saying, oh, it's hard, we're out, because that's not what civil society does. We as a sector run towards the hard problems. That's why we exist. We're meeting needs where those needs aren't being met in more traditional ways by governments or business or other commercial enterprises. So what are the kinds of things that let us see some of those glimmers? We are seeing some foundations in the United States, led by the MacArthur Foundation, increase their payouts to meet the current moments. MacArthur has increased the percent that they're making available as grants. We're seeing other foundations speed up their grant making and turn themselves into spend down foundations, notably the Gates Foundation, so that they aren't looking at preserving their wealth so that the institution can exist over time. We are seeing collectives that are built to fight digital threats. One of our speakers earlier in the session on the first day, actually, he was the speaker that kicked us off, was from Cyber Peace Institute, and they have put together a service called Cyber Peace Builders, where they're bringing in volunteers from the corporate sector to help meet the cybersecurity needs of organizations. And they do the vetting and the work so that we can be comfortable that volunteer knows what they're doing. We're seeing new entities being formed to bring critical infrastructure in our communities. Connect Humanity is one of these organizations that has been focused on developing funding instruments to bring internet connectivity into communities that don't have it or don't have stable internet connectivity. We're seeing these decentralized, youth-driven groups that are advocating for climate justice. These are powerful people working for climate rights and to help repair the damage that's been done to the planet and to stop it going forward. And then mutual aid networks formed to meet emerging needs. These are a group of community members, proto-organizations, proximate groups that are springing up to respond to something that has happened in their community. Now, all of these things are part of what civil society has always done, but is doing to meet the pressures that we're under today. I believe that collaboration is a big part of all of those strategies, and it needs to be one of the strategies that we need to employ collaboration more and more as civil society organizations, individually and as a sector. So what I want to go through is, in most of this talk, is talk through 5 strategies to aid you as you think about collaboration inside your organization. And I've helpfully numbered them so you know how far along in the talk I am. And I'm keeping a little bit of an eye on the chat here, though that's always a little hard when you're also presenting. So do feel free to drop in any questions or comments. If you have them, I'll try to catch them. And certainly if we get to the end and have a little bit of time left over, we can look at that as well. So first thing, use participatory processes to build your agenda. The speakers that we had talking about misinformation and counter narratives talked about how important it is for us to stay focused on our agenda and not just get pulled off to fight competing claims about what the truth is or isn't, or what's happening in the community. What does that mean? Building using participatory processes. They talked about actually getting into the community. So you're bringing community members together and you're working so that you can have confidence that the agenda represents all of you and not just the people in a position to put forward an agenda and follow it. And so that idea, as one of the speakers talked about, that we're not just doing armchair storytelling, but we're actually going out into our community and listening to their words and their voices, and we're amplifying them. And I believe we should be amplifying them to share the agenda. So we know, for example, as a capacity building organization working in the field of technology, that cost is a primary concern for organizations. So we're always, as a part of our agenda, always needs to be, how are we helping organizations lower the overall cost of accessing, adopting, and optimizing their technology? And what are the ways that we're pulling them in so that we understand how it is and isn't working for them? And there are a lot of tools and community processes for being able to do that. A lot of participatory research design work, particularly in fields of social work, have been done so that programmatic work and advocacy is informed by community members, and they are a key voice as part of it. And I think it's incredibly important that we make those processes a deliberate part of our work. And it's time consuming and it's hard, but we have to devote the time. I think one of the hardest things is that giving people the actual ability to influence your agenda means that you may have to take the things that you thought were most important off of it, because that's not what the community thinks it's most important. But that element of rigor is an important element of rigor that we need to bring into our conversations. 2, map the ecosystem. We need to know who the other players are that are working on particular issues in a particular geography. We have to have a clear idea about how those organizations work together. When Melvin was talking earlier today, he was talking about one of the first speakers we had, Linda Widdop from Tech Impact. And on the second day, Heck Maldonado Reese was also a speaker, also from Tech Impact. In a conventional sense, you might look at us as competitors. We both offer technology capacity building support to organizations, but in fact, we're so much stronger together. There's all this work that we frankly don't have to do because Tech Impact is awesome at it. And I would like to think there's work that they don't have to do because we are awesome at it. And I think, mapping the ecosystem helps us make that decision. So the scarce resources, those resources that are compressed because of all those increasing pressures, we're able to devote them on what we can be uniquely good at. And then we partner and we share the space with others in the ecosystem. So we see this all the time with social services as well, and that the temptation can be to see a gap and go immediately to filling the need. That's why we work in the nonprofit sector. For many of us, that's why the nonprofit we work for exists, or maybe why we started the organization. But taking that moment to, first off, understand the agenda of the people that you wish to serve and what's important to them, and then map the ecosystem of who's providing it helps us make great partnerships and collaborations and helps us focus on what's genuinely missing and what can provide more support inside the community. 3, build for sharing. This is a place where my big, wide, geeky streak is going to show. But building for sharing means that you're thinking about how you can reuse the things that you build, so it's more inclusive, but also how you can share them. And I'm going to provide a couple of examples of what I mean. The first one is, as I said, quite geeky. So humor me for a moment on this. But this is about how we set up data dictionaries and definitions and describe our data. So there's metadata around any data point that says what it is. Marnie Webb is the data point. Metadata is that's my name. But then you can break that down into my first name and my last name, but I also have a middle name that we can put in there. I might have an honorific. I might have other names. How do we describe that so that name can be used in multiple systems? And for any of us that have struggled to put in a name that does not conform to the typical Western tradition that my name conforms to, for example, first name, middle name, family name is the last name. We see all the problems of not having good metadata to describe those parts, and we built in this assumption that names work a single way. But by going in and actually being robust in how we describe the data that we're collecting and the metadata that we put around it, lets us better share and have systems collaborate better. It can help social workers be able to provide services to people and, with their permission, of course, share data between systems. It can help us, frankly, deduplicate and practice good hygiene on our records. And that's just talking about names. Forget about talking about, the wide range of complexities that we do. There's a system for metadata, schema.org, that I admire very much because it's built on this idea that we want actually verbose ways of describing the data so that we can put together different kinds of data that we might not have planned to come together. And for me, that's what building for sharing does, right? I said this part was going to be geeky. It lets us be able to put information so that we can have unexpected collaborations that don't require us to rework our systems. And we can better combine information. So that was my geeky example. I'm going to give you a less geeky example from one of our own services called NGO Source. NGO Source is a service that we provide to grant makers, U.S. grant makers, in which we say, hey, that organization located in, Germany or in Kenya or in Japan or in Argentina or in Indonesia, if it were located in the United States, it would meet the requirements that the IRS has, and it would get 501c3 status. And because it would meet those requirements, you get to, you can give it a grant and it can count. It can count as a grant just like you'd give it in the United States, right? So it's based on U.S. tax law. And previously, in years before, everybody was required to do that for themselves. So the Ford Foundation had to do it and the Rockefeller Foundation had to do it. It was a pretty expensive process. And small foundations didn't often participate in it because it was an expensive process. But through advocacy from a network of folks in the sector and the work that we did on the resulting funded service NGO Source, we're able to use a repository model where if one foundation gets an ED for one foundation, we can more quickly do the ruling for other foundations, effectively lowering the cost, the literal price of giving to organizations outside of the United States, making it easier for small foundations to be able to take advantage of all the work that the Fords and the Rockefellers and the Gates and the MacArthurs have done in providing getting equivalency determinations, and they can give. So that idea that you built this shared repository so that we can share this resource, these are fundable organizations around the world, allowed more money to go to the organizations instead of go to the system of vetting. And I think those kinds of things where we're building systems that say, okay, we know this, we learned this stuff. How do we put this together to make it easier to get resources out into our communities or out to different places? But that idea that whatever area you're working on, you're thinking very deliberately about how you build for sharing, it is a very important part of collaboration, because it means that when we collaborate with somebody, we can go in and get going, instead of needing to go into a system and figure out all the rules for collaboration. It starts to give you some of those rules, and that goes into the fourth thing, which is leaning on frameworks. The more that we can use frameworks to describe the progression through a system or the stages of support, the easier it is for us to make transparent how resources flow and how they work. Again, I'm going to give you an example for our own work, but we have a project called STEP. It is a way of doing strengthening and tiered evaluation. It's actually probably at strengthening tiered evaluation processes that help an organization understand their own capacity in different areas. And the benefit of a framework is then you can make a good decision about what capacity you want to have. So in this example, I can go in and say as an organization, hey, I did this evaluation on myself, and in the area of finances, I'm at a level 3. And you know what? That's okay with me. I don't have to be at a higher level because the things that come with a higher level, I don't need. So it's all right for me to be a 3. But I think when we're all working with common frameworks, it allows us to be able to identify where we want to be in a particular capacity. It allows us to understand what that might mean for partnerships. And I believe that the more we can make that kind of capacity building transparent, the more it can help us partner with other entities. So we might say, well, I'm a 3. To get this grant, the grant maker is requiring somebody's a 4 in the level of financial compliance. I'm going to partner with somebody that's a 4. I don't have to change it. Let me partner and collaborate with somebody that already has that skill rather than me investing in getting there and then competing with them. So I think that it helps us at the sector level be able to, as one of the speakers earlier said, distribute the burden. So those entities that are better able to carry some level of compliance or some level of burden can do so. I think this sort of theory helps us think about how we might fit together like puzzle pieces with other organizations, but it also lets us make good decisions about our own investment and work inside our organization where it really matters to us. Again, we're always, taking this lens, and, we are at TechSoup certainly, that we have compressed resources to meet increased need. So we want to make sure that our investments are good ones and unique. And if we can lean on some of our colleagues that have already made those investments, they're doing great work in the field, we want to be able to do that, and the frameworks support that. I think the other thing that frameworks do, and certainly it's important to us when we think about the organizations we serve, is it actually can make transparent decision-making and that transparency can make it easier to trust folks. And so if one of our partners, an organization that's in Ireland, has made a social service system that supports people that are dealing with substance abuse. And one of the things that they built into their system was actually a way to be able to show the client, this is how you were doing, this is how you're doing now, so that it made their progress transparent to them, because they didn't always feel their progress. It didn't always feel easier, right? If every day felt hard, but whenever you had a way of measuring what you were like in the past and what you were feeling in the past against today, and not just looking at it through a narrower lens, you were able to see your progress. And I always admired that. I still admire that so much, because they weren't just taking the information and using it for themselves and saying, oh, we can demonstrate that this many people get better with these kind of interventions to help us get more funding, which of course we want, right? We want to be able to describe and do. But they were actually able to show it and use it to help motivate clients to take action. And it was actually a tool for conversation that made that same that impact decision-making. It shared that, and other people were able to get insights in ways that were meaningful to them. 5, so you remember it's 5 strategies, so I'm just getting into closing, is designed for a shifting center. It's hard for me to think about how to put this one in, and I might struggle a little bit with how to describe this, but when we think about networks or collaborations, there's often one entity or organization that's driving it, and they're in the center of it. And that entity or organization, whether explicit in the governance models or not, is sort of setting the rules. They may be setting everyone's agenda. They may be the one that is saying, this is how we share. So they may be defining how you share and build. And the strength of that network depends on the strength of that one central entity. And all kinds of things can disrupt the strength of that central entity. Funding changes, regulatory changes in their country, natural disasters, climate disasters, war, economic disasters or shifts, those can all have a huge impact on that central entity. And then the whole network can fall apart when that central entity falls apart. But if we design for a shifting center, if we design with the idea of sharing the burden among our colleagues and leaning on them for strengths, then it helps us keep networks going, even whenever a central organization's capabilities may change, because somebody else can step in. Again, I believe that building for sharing and leaning on frameworks is what makes this possible. so that you know how to do it. But it's about taking governance very seriously. It's about everybody being bought into that common agenda so that as one organization may not be able to take on all of the burden at times, somebody else can step in and do it. Some of us do that in our communities because it's part of our programmatic continuity planning, or because something changed in our communities and we have to pick up the work of an organization that has stopped being able to work. I read an article a while back now, so I'm not going to get the details right, about a food pantry, I believe it was, in a food bank in Nashville that closed. And all of a sudden it was big and it had this huge effect on the community. And the other organizations providing comparable services had to get together and say, okay, how are we making sure the needs that were being met by that one institution we can all meet? And they were doing it reactively after the fact. Yesterday at the event in Oakland, I was talking about somebody that ran a homeless services shelter in Altadena, California. And whenever the fires went through in that area, they had to move people from their shelters into downtown Los Angeles, right? So we have all these examples of when the center needed to shift in these loosely formed networks. But actually, how do we keep the networks loosely formed, but better designed so that those shifts can happen, and not just because of some disaster or closing or in a reactive way, but actually so we can balance responsibility and burden and maybe keep more resources going. And all of this, the key thing is that resilience requires all of us. It requires all of us working together in a planned and coordinated effort. It requires us holding spaces where we are able to talk to each other. It also requires us to think about collaboration as a part of our resilience strategy when we are designing our systems and we're designing our programs. As we set up our sessions, and as we worked on these sessions, we thought a lot about how do we think about all the things that are required for us to be resilient as a sector. And I think one of the biggest things is that we keep talking to each other. And that ability to communicate, because we have the infrastructure to communicate, because we have the tools to communicate, because we have the patience to communicate, because 75% of communicating is listening, and we have the patience to do that, it's so important. And that's about the human will to communicate and collaborate. And I'm happy that we had the terrific speakers that we had over the course of this session, and we had all of you to participate in this with us. So thank you very much for being a part of our network and collaborating with us on these talks. I appreciate it, and I hope you all have a good day.